By the summer of 1944, the German prisoners of war scattered across the American heartland had long since stopped expecting rescue. They had become part of the rhythm of their captors' nation, picking fruit, cutting timber, operating machines, and stacking canned goods for a war effort that seemed as limitless as the land itself. Many of them worked the harvest that year, witnessing what one called the true miracle of democracy. In Kansas, POWs stood atop hills and watched endless combines crawling across oceans of gold. Each machine harvested 100 acres of wheat a day. The grain elevators along the rail lines filled faster than they could be emptied. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote home after seeing it. One American farmer with his machines does the work of 100 Germans. They showed me photographs of wheat fields stretching beyond the horizon, thousands of square miles. They could lose half their crop and still feed all of Europe. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit under a sun so bright it seemed unreal. Orchards stretched farther than the eye could see, and rivers of produce moved toward canning plants. And yet, what stunned them most wasn't abundance, it was waste. Sometimes entire fields were plowed under to control prices. Gefreiter Otto Schulz, who had survived on black bread and horse meat in North Africa, could hardly bear the sight. They destroyed food to keep prices stable. Mountains of oranges buried by bulldozers. We begged them to send the fruit to Germany. The guards were kind, but they said it was impossible. It was not cruelty, it was indifference born of plenty. For men raised in a regime that glorified struggle and scarcity, this was incomprehensible power. It wasn't arrogance, it was capacity. Then came June 6, 1944. Word of the Allied invasion of Normandy swept through the camps like fire through dry grass. When the prisoners saw the first newsreels a week later, silence filled the recreation halls. They watched endless streams of ships, 6,000 of them, carrying men, tanks, and supplies across the channel. They saw the artificial harbors, the convoys of trucks, and the skies thick with 11,000 aircraft. The scale was beyond imagination. Obergefreiter Friedrich von Tauben, captured in Tunisia, wrote simply, "At that moment, we knew not only that the war was lost, but that our entire belief system had been a lie. We had challenged the greatest industrial power in the world with fairy tales about racial destiny. We sent horses against trucks, courage against machines, and faith against organization." The invasion films showed more than military triumph. They showed logistics, coordination, and sheer abundance. To the prisoners, these were the final proofs. Their leaders had promised that decadence would rot America from within. But decadence did not build artificial harbors, supply millions of men, and land them under fire. They realized then America's strength came not from ideology, but from practicality, its ability to produce, adapt, and collaborate without fear or hierarchy. The kindness of enemies. Through 1944 and 1945, thousands of small acts of compassion began to alter the prisoners in ways they never expected. The guards treated them firmly but fairly. Local civilians sometimes offered small kindnesses, coffee, cigarettes, even sympathy. When Gefreiter Hans Müller received word that his son had died in the Hamburg bombings, the American camp commander personally delivered the telegram and expressed condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she was starving, American church groups quietly sent her food parcels through the Red Cross. Enemy civilians in a country the U.S. Air Force was bombing nightly. The prisoners were stunned. They had been told Americans were brutal, materialistic, without honor, but their captors behaved as though humanity mattered more than vengeance. Unteroffizier Otto Henke later said, "They separated Germans from Nazis. They fought Hitler, not us. I did not believe them until they proved it." That distinction between the regime and the people would shape everything that followed. Inside the camps, American doctors began offering mental health treatment to those suffering breakdowns, something unheard of in the Wehrmacht. Prisoners who attempted suicide were not punished, but counseled. Shell-shocked veterans were treated with empathy. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the surgeon from Camp Herne, recorded his astonishment. "They treated us as patients, not criminals. They believed even an enemy deserved dignity. In that moment, I understood the meaning of civilization." The Americans' greatest psychological weapon wasn't propaganda, it was normalcy. Every light bulb, every hot meal, every medical checkup quietly declared, "This is what a free society can do." It was this quiet, steady exposure to ordinary abundance that broke the ideological walls the Nazis had built. By early 1945, the U.S. War Department's Special Projects Division had fully embraced the potential of this transformation. They organized structured courses in history, economics, and politics. Lectures were voluntary, but attendance grew rapidly. Over 25,000 German POWs joined classes on democracy. Camp newspapers debated freedom of speech, women's rights, and the structure of the American Constitution. In open forums, prisoners, once sworn Nazis, argued over how to rebuild Germany after defeat. The results astonished their American overseers. Oberfeldwebel Gustav Hermann, once a party member, wrote in an essay for the camp's internal paper, "We were told democracy was weakness, but I have seen it function with order, efficiency, and compassion. It creates strength through cooperation. I now believe our future depends on it." Even the most hardened officers began to rethink their past. They had witnessed a country where every citizen had food, work, and rights, and where even prisoners were treated as men, not machines. For many German soldiers, the most shocking revelation came not from factories or farms, but from the people who ran them. They saw women driving trucks, welding steel, operating cranes. They saw African Americans and immigrants working side by side with whites, something Nazi ideology had insisted was impossible. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, who worked at the Higgins boat factory in New Orleans, described his astonishment. "Women and Negroes building ships, teenagers running drills, old men supervising. We laughed at first, then we realized it worked. They produced 700 boats a month. We could not match that with all our slave labor." It wasn't just efficiency, it was unity. A society that could use all its people's talents, regardless of class or color, was undefeatable. The prisoners began to see the great paradox of America, a nation still struggling with its own prejudices, yet already living proof that diversity could be power, not weakness. By late 1944, thousands of POWs were writing letters home through Red Cross channels. Most were censored for military content, but not for emotion. And what they described was extraordinary. "We eat meat every day. The guards are fair. Even the Negroes have cars. If this is enemy land, then our leaders have lied." Those letters, smuggled and whispered across Germany, carried more weight than any Allied leaflet drop. Even in ruins, families began to question what they had been told. For some, the truth of their son's captivity, humane, abundant, and just, was the first flicker of doubt that would later open the door to post-war democracy. In April 1945, the Allied forces liberated the concentration camps in Germany. At first, American officers hesitated to show the footage to German POWs. They feared disbelief, hysteria, or violence. But eventually, they did. They screened the films, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and read the witness accounts aloud. At first, denial filled the rooms. It's propaganda, some said. Impossible. Then came the silence. Then came tears. Oberlieutenant Walter Schmidt wrote afterwards, "We thought we were warriors of a noble cause. We discovered we were tools of murderers. The Americans we called decadent had shown us what civilization meant. We had believed ourselves civilized and found that we were not." That revelation destroyed whatever fragments of pride remained. For many, it was not just military defeat, it was moral annihilation. And in that moral vacuum, new ideas could finally take root. As the war drew to its end in May 1945, the prisoners were no longer just captives. They were students of democracy, economics, and industry. The Americans began preparing them for repatriation, not as enemies, but as future citizens of a new Germany. They provided vocational training, agricultural education, and discussions about the coming Marshall Plan even before it was announced. Feldwebel Franz von Tauben remembered, "They gave us knowledge instead of punishment. They said, 'You will need this to rebuild.' I could not understand it. Why teach your enemies to rise again?" But they meant it. That generosity, that faith in renewal, was perhaps America's most disarming weapon of all. When repatriation began in 1945 and 1946, over 370,000 German POWs returned home from the United States. They left a country that had fed, healed, and educated them, while their own lay in ashes. Many would never forget it. Some refused to leave, applying to stay in America. Thousands wrote back for years, maintaining friendships with the very farmers and guards who had once watched them through barbed wire. They returned to Germany carrying not bitterness, but blueprints, mental and moral, for something new. They had seen that prosperity came not from conquest, but from cooperation, not from obedience, but from freedom. In the years after the war, the influence of these former prisoners quietly spread through West Germany. Many became teachers, engineers, and politicians. Some would later help shape the institutions of modern Europe. Hans Kroll, once a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to Washington. Walter Hallstein, who had lectured in a Texas camp, later became president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Marr, held at Camp Herne, served as Germany's representative to the United Nations. Each carried fragments of what they had seen: the efficiency of Ford's assembly lines, the democracy of town hall meetings, the humanity of ordinary Americans. "We learned that freedom creates abundance," Hans Kroll later wrote. "That wealth is born not from fear, but from trust." Their transformation had not been forced, it had been observed. They had lived democracy, even behind fences, and found it stronger than tyranny. Historians would later call it the most successful re-education program in modern history. And yet, it was never really a program, it was exposure. Every meal, every classroom, every act of decency was a lesson. The camps themselves had become universities of democracy. Dr. Arnold Kramer, who would later document the phenomenon, summarized it best. America won the war of ideas not through persuasion, but through reality. Every electric light, every full stomach, every gesture of respect spoke louder than 1,000 speeches. By the time the last ships departed American shores, the men who boarded them were not the same soldiers who had arrived from Africa in 1943. They had come believing in a 1,000-year Reich. They left believing in the possibility of 1,000 years of peace. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. As victory bells rang across the United States, behind the fences of hundreds of POW camps, thousands of German soldiers stood quietly, uncertain how to feel. They were free from war, but not yet free men. They had seen the truth about America, its endless resources, its machinery, its compassion. And now they faced the reality of returning to a homeland reduced to rubble. Between 1945 and 1946, over 370,000 German prisoners were repatriated from camps across 45 American states. They boarded trains with new clothes, packed rations, and for many, heavy hearts. Oberfeldwebel Otto Henke, who had worked on Iowa farms, wrote in his farewell note, "We arrived here as conquerors, certain of our superiority. We leave as students. We have seen what freedom builds, and it has changed us forever." Each man carried more than memories. He carried knowledge, how to organize production, how to treat workers, how to balance freedom and discipline. The journey home was bittersweet. They would return to mothers and wives, yes, but also to cities flattened, families lost, and a moral world turned upside down. And yet, they returned with something Germany desperately needed: hope grounded in reality. Repatriated POWs soon became an invisible network of reformers across post-war Germany. They were not political leaders or generals. They were farmers, engineers, teachers, and foremen. But they had seen firsthand what an industrial democracy looked like. They had seen assembly lines where every worker mattered. They had seen farms powered by electricity, not ideology. They had seen racial cooperation achieve what racial purity never could. They carried those lessons home quietly, into reconstruction offices, local councils, and factories rising from the ruins. When the Marshall Plan began in 1947, its philosophy felt familiar to them. They had already lived its spirit behind barbed wire. They had seen that prosperity could be created not through conquest, but through cooperation. Hans Kroll, former POW and later West German ambassador to the United States, wrote in his memoirs, "We discovered that democracy was not chaos. It was a system built on trust and shared responsibility. It could build a society where even former enemies found dignity." The Wirtschaftswunder, Germany's post-war economic miracle, owed more to factories and ideas than to any single plan. Many of its architects had once worn field gray uniforms and spent their captivity watching American machines run 24 hours a day. Historians often describe the transformation of German POWs in America as the quietest revolution of the 20th century. It happened not through speeches, but through sight, through the simple, undeniable power of example. The American Guards never preached democracy. They demonstrated it by treating their prisoners like men. There was order, but no cruelty. Discipline, but no humiliation. Efficiency, but with compassion. This combination broke through where Allied propaganda had failed. Dr. Arnold Kramer, who later compiled extensive interviews from former POWs, summarized it perfectly. The Americans won the ideological war not with slogans, but with plumbing and electricity. Every working toilet, every hot meal, every fair command was proof of an idea that freedom could be efficient and decency could be powerful. For the men who had grown up in Hitler's Germany, this was revolutionary. They had been taught that democracy was weakness, but in America, they saw a democracy that built battleships faster than their factories could produce rifles. They learned that compassion was not the opposite of strength. It was its foundation. As the post-war years unfolded, many former prisoners kept in touch with their American hosts. They sent letters, exchanged family photos, and sometimes even returned as visitors or immigrants. By the 1950s, thousands of former POWs had chosen to immigrate permanently to the United States. Some married American women through correspondence programs that had begun during captivity. Others became translators, engineers, or teachers, carrying American methods into a new era of cooperation. Their experiences became bridges between two former enemies. When West Germany joined NATO in 1955, many of the diplomats and officers at the table had once been POWs in Texas, Oklahoma, or Iowa. They had seen America not just as a superpower, but as a teacher. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Bauer, the doctor who had marveled at American hospitals, later said in an interview, "I saw more humanity in captivity than in all my years of service under Hitler." That memory shaped everything I did after. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, a remarkable event took place. More than 500 former German prisoners of war returned to the United States for a reunion in Austin, Texas. They came as old men, gray-haired and stooped, some bringing their children and grandchildren. The gathering included farmers, doctors, engineers, and diplomats, men who had once worn the swastika on their uniforms and now came to thank the nation that had changed them. Dr. Hans Wehr, once a young sergeant at Fort Robinson, spoke to the audience. "For many of us, life in captivity was an improvement. We discovered running water, central heating, and full meals. But more than that, we discovered dignity." Another former prisoner, Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Meyer, who had worked on a farm in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as sons far from home. They shared their meals, their stories, sometimes even their homes. That kindness changed us forever." Then the final speaker took the stage. Hermann Gutz, 78 years old, once a lieutenant in the Panzer divisions, now a retired teacher. His words captured the spirit of every man in the room. "We came to America as enemies, believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from creation, not from hate, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom." As he finished, the hall rose to its feet. Americans and Germans alike stood together, former enemies united by gratitude. Some wept openly. It was perhaps the most human victory of the war. Historians have since pieced together the vast scale of the POW system in America, a system remarkable not for its size, but for its humanity. Over 500 camps operated across 45 states, from Maine to California. 371,683 German prisoners were held in total, part of more than 425,000 Axis POWs. The camps were built in an average of 90 days, housing anywhere from 250 to 12,000 men each. On average, 20,000 prisoners arrived each month in 1943, rising to 60,000 monthly by 1945. Labor contributions totaled more than 14 million man-days of farm work, processing 100 million board feet of lumber, and generating $230 million in value, worth billions of dollars today. Escape attempts were almost non-existent, only 2,222 recorded, a mere 0.6%, with none successful for more than 24 hours. But the most telling statistics weren't about work or security. They were about transformation. 95% of prisoners rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% said their captivity changed their worldview for the better. Fewer than 10% still held Nazi beliefs by 1945. Over 12,000 maintained correspondence with American families for decades afterward. The average friendship lasted 31 years. The data told the same story as the diaries. Defeat had turned into enlightenment. The German POWs in America became, in a sense, unintentional ambassadors of democracy. When they returned home, they carried with them not propaganda, but proof. They had seen a society where the working man could own a car, where farmers had electricity, where even prisoners were treated as human beings. And they carried those images into a Germany desperate for rebuilding, morality, and meaning. The lesson was simple but profound. Freedom produced abundance. Cooperation created power. Respect sustained order. America had not merely defeated Germany militarily, it had conquered its illusions. The legacy of those camps extended far beyond economics or politics. It reshaped how nations thought about victory itself. The United States had demonstrated that moral strength could coexist with military power, that mercy could achieve what bombs could not. In the long arc of history, the most decisive American victory was not D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge. It was the quiet conquest of hearts in Texas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. As one historian later put it, America's most powerful weapon was not the atom bomb, but the refrigerator, the light bulb, and the open hand. The German POWs had arrived believing that force ruled the world. They left believing that creation, compassion, and freedom could rule it better. By the 1980s, many of those former prisoners were grandfathers, their children and grandchildren growing up in a democratic, prosperous Germany. Few of them ever forgot the lessons they had learned in captivity. Some still wrote letters to the American families who had shown them kindness. Others visited the farms or small towns where they had once worked. A few were even buried in American soil, their graves marked not as enemies, but as men redeemed by understanding. Unteroffizier Karl Meinhardt, whose letters from Camp Shelby are preserved in a Texas museum, wrote before his death in 1983, "We came to America expecting hatred and found humanity. We left with the conviction that power and goodness can exist together. It was the greatest lesson of my life." The eternal lesson. The story of the German prisoners in America is not merely a tale of war, it is a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that sometimes the most decisive victories are not won by destruction, but by demonstration. Not through speeches, but through example. The camps became classrooms, the prisoners became students, and democracy became the teacher. And what they learned would help rebuild a continent. They had arrived as warriors of a lost cause. They departed as witnesses to a better one. In their memories, the lights of American towns still shone, the lights they had seen from train windows, stretching across the night like constellations of civilization itself. Those lights had burned away propaganda and pride, leaving only truth, that the real strength of a nation lies not in its armies, but in its ability to lift others, even its enemies, into the light. Looking back, historians agree that the German POW experience in America marked one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. Without coercion, without indoctrination, the U.S. turned captives of fascism into advocates of freedom. It was not through slogans, but through the daily evidence of a functioning, humane society. Every illuminated street, every full plate, every fair act of discipline spoke louder than ideology. When the last ship carrying POWs departed American shores in 1946, the men aboard no longer represented a defeated army. They were the carriers of a new idea, the seed of a democratic Germany that would soon rise from the ashes. They had come as prisoners of war. They left as witnesses to what free people could achieve. And in that transformation, America achieved its most profound victory, not the destruction of an enemy, but the rebirth of an ally.